So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you joining from around the world. Welcome to this special edition of the UNESCO Masterclass in the occasion of World Philosophy Day. My name is Arlene Pimentel from the Dominican Republic, and I am delighted to be your moderator today. Let me remind the participants they would have available interpretation both in French and English, so you may wish to choose your preferred language by clicking on the globe on your screen. It is now my pleasure to welcome also the students who are participating in this masterclass. You young women and men from different regions of the world who have joined us to learn more and become part of this growing community of your leaders advocating for both peace, tolerance, nonviolence, inclusion, and diversity. We are also very proud to welcome the teachers of today's masterclass, who are definitely a key in our human development. We actually all remember special teachers in our lives, don't we? So welcome, teachers, and thank you for being here. Now I'm going to give the floor to Ms. Ana Maria Mailoff, the Chief of Inclusion and Rights section here at UNESCO. Ana Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arlene. And as you said, a big welcome to all the students from all around the world. And good afternoon from UNESCO Paris. As many of you already know, the masterclasses against racism and discriminations were actually launched by UNESCO in November 2019 as the Global Training for Trainers initiative, with the aim to empower students to become youth champions in their own schools, families, and communities. By using a human rights-based approach and a gender lens, the courses address various topics related to inclusion and non-discrimination, such as racial discrimination, gender-based discrimination, rights of indigenous people, and even discrimination against persons with disabilities. And each edition of the masterclass concludes with the adoption of the young participants' commitments in designing and pursuing their own activities. Now, today we are organizing a very special edition on the occasion of World Philosophy Day, with the aim to invite all of you to question the biases and the stereotypes that lead to racism and discrimination through the critical study of the construction of the other. And of course, we hope really that you will come up with very powerful commitments to combat racism and discriminations in your everyday life. So I will stop here and I wish all of us a very fruitful masterclass. Over to you, Arlene. Thank you. We don't hear you, Arlene.
Okay, thank you so much. I was saying thank you, Ana Maria, for instance, this introduction. So let's now welcome our speakers to our bilingual masterclass today. Souhaitons la bienvenue à Monsieur Arnaud Desmanches, qui séjourne à nous en tant qu'humoriste. Donc bonjour, messieurs. Bonjour à la professeure Carole Reynaud-Paligot, historienne.
Hello also to Carole Reynaud-Paligot, who is a history teacher at Panthéon-Sorbonne. Hello to Lazare Kizerbo, who will be our in-house philosopher.
The Executive Dean of Arts at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. And last but not least, we welcome as well Mr. Sanele Sava, activist and founder of the Rolled Sleeves Outreach Program that might join us later because of personal duties. So let's now begin. And I'm going to present our first speaker, Madam, sorry, I just need you to reminder that before we hear from our speakers, from our teachers, I would like to encourage everyone to make this masterclass as dynamic and as interactive as possible. During each lecture of our teachers can ask questions to the students and students can use the chat box to answer. Each lecture will last for 15 minutes and will be preceded by a 5-minute Q&A question. So feel free at any time to put your questions in the Q&A box. Now, I would like to present our first speaker in French. So for those of you that needs to change the interpretation, let's welcome Professeur Carole Reynaud-Paligot, qui est enseignante à l'Université de Bourgogne.
She is a teacher at the Université Franche-Comté. She was co-scientific commissioner for the exhibition Nous et les autres on racism and prejudice. She also teaches in New York, in Paris, and in California, the California University in Paris. So, Miss Reynaud-Paligot, you got the floor for 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to try to put up my slides.
I hope that everybody will be able to see it.
Voilà. Alors, voilà, je pense qu'il est à l'écran pour tout le
Here
monde.
we are. I think everyone can see it on the screen now. I'm going to give you a very quick summary because there are so many things that need to be said. You've got historians, psychologists, sociologists working on all these issues, but unfortunately, the contribution of science has not been spread out to a general public, and so we're interested in that, and that's why I'm here today. But to understand racism, I think we need to combine two approaches. One is at the individual level, which means that racism is basically an interaction between individuals, between a person who's a racist and a person who's a victim or who is seen in a racial way. And this is a fundamental approach because it means that we can understand the psychological aspects and particularly to look at the matter of the distress felt by the victim, and that's of critical importance. However, if we just restrict ourselves to that micro-sociological approach at the level of the individual, then we will not be able to understand why certain people make racist statements or carry out violent acts towards other people. So this is something you can see at a higher level, a macro-sociological level, the level of society, and that will help us understand why people today can have racist feelings and commit racist acts. In other words, this means racism is a social construct. It is built in society. It is the product of society, of the society we live in. In other words, this means that racism is not a fatality. We must stand up against such fatalistic arguments where people say, well, racism has always existed and it will always exist. It's part of human nature. But human nature has lots of things. You have feelings where people reject others, where people hate others or express violence to others, but human nature also shows a spirit of solidarity and altruism. So human nature, when you see it at the level of human nature, is not a way of understanding racism. Sometimes we're talking about rejecting others, and sometimes we're talking about expressing a feeling of solidarity. So how can we work out why it's sometimes and sometimes? I'd like to propose a socio-historic approach for that. In other words, you have to look at the specific context where racism can occur. In other words, we need to ask the question as to why, at a given point in time, in a given society, you will find racism spreading, or even become official state racism, institutionalized racism, if the country passed racist legislation and organizes a racist society. Hence the importance of looking at history, not just for finding out what has happened in the past or for adopting a moralizing approach. Okay, we need to have a moralizing approach, but you need to have more than that. We need to try and understand why this has occurred and how. Because once you identify the reasons explaining racism and the mechanisms at play, then we can reach a certain level of understanding and you can start doing something about it because you know who to take action on or with. Now, this might seem a bit abstract, so I'd like to give you some historic examples. They're well-known examples. You have slavery in North America, and that was extended through racial segregation up till the mid-60s in the United States. You can look at Nazism and apartheid. Now, these are examples we can find in history, and with hindsight, we can make analyses of this. This is what historians do. They use basic source materials, and we can understand how the situation, the context, or certain situations fostered such racism. And we can see who the players were in society, who were the ones taking action, who spread and activated racist feeling and racist ideologies. Very quickly, I don't want to give you a long lecture on history, but we want to use history to understand what's at stake here. Now, what can we find from studies? Well, there are certain contexts which foster racism, and there are two types of context that foster racism. You could say colonialism in the broad sense, and you can include slavery in that. That means that when you have imperial societies that decide to claim ownership of a country and make money from it and to gain from it, to gain prestige and honor as well. In each of these situations where you have one country dominating another, there are communities dominating others or people dominating others, or you can have certain social groups dominating other social groups, because you can find domination at different levels. You can see it at an international level, at a national level, or inside at a smaller level. But once you have a relationship based on domination, you can understand that the dominating power or the dominating people need to grant no value to the people they are dominating, because that way they can strengthen their domination. In history, we can see this in terminology and attitudes that are different, but you always have the idea of domination and depreciating the others. It means that you can look through centuries of history, and we talked about higher races or superior races that dominated lower races. And this was almost consensus. It was a hierarchical arrangement, and it was completely inegalitarian. And in colonial history, we can see that racism prospered, because when no value is granted to the other people, you end up in situations of basic racism. I'll come back to that later. So that's the first context, the colonial context. We can cite the case of Europe, but you could also take the case of Japan, because we shouldn't think that it's a phenomenon that you only find in Europe. Of course, there was European colonialism, but if you look at the history of Japan, when Japan extended its domination over the entire archipelago there, all the islands, it dominated the native peoples, and they were completely devalued. People talked about the Japanese being the superior race, the higher people, and the native people being of lower value. So people say that the people are dominated are of no value, they're backward people, and all sorts of arguments like that are used to justify the domination. Another context which is important is the context of nationalism. Nationalism is an ideology which emerged in Europe and around the world. You can find it everywhere around the world today, and it's related to the emergence of the nation state. And here you have a version of the nation state which is associated with the right wing or the far right, and it's a specific ideology. And it cultivates ideas of national grandeur, the idea of being superior, feeling better than others. You glorify your own nation, and you give no credit to others. And often the depreciation of others means you completely reject others. They're seen as being completely different. So such nationalist situations exist, and I could give you some striking examples, the most striking one being Nazism. Nazism was not a colonial regime, but it was an ideology based on extreme nationalism. Nazism rejected a large part of the people, Jews, of course, but also Gypsies and Slavic people. So nationalism, when we reject other people, you can see that there are nationalistic values involved. So each time nationalism emerges, you have a situation which is likely to foster and help develop racism. So you have to understand the context, as I said, that's the first point. And then you have to see what the different players are involved in society. When you look at institutionalized racism, you have to see the role of the political elite. That's the example of Nazism. You can see that there was an elite that wanted power and developed absolute hatred of others to make sure it dominated. You can also have economic players in slavery and colonial settings. You have political elites, but you also have economic elites. And they had an economic interest in exploiting other lands. In institutionalized racism, we can also see intellectual elites who are involved. For example, for more than 2 centuries, we saw that scientists who maintained that there were superior races and inferior races, that was official science, and you can imagine the impact that had when you have science confirming that certain races are superior and that there is basic inequality between races. And then even intellectual elites spread such ideas. We've got novelists who spread such ideas based on total inequality, and we have examples of that with some of our greatest literary authors. We mustn't just go back and say it's only the elites that are responsible for this and they're manipulating the masses. No, because there are other players in society who are involved, and you can see people from civil society involved. For civil society, that means basic citizens. They can also be players involved in this. They too can be involved in these racist visions. They can gain from it. They can gain financially. For example, when Jewish property was stolen during the war, there were citizens in France and elsewhere who profited from taking the private property of Jewish people. So you can get people making profit from it in civil society. Another type of reaction we can see in civil society is that people who just sit back and wait, they don't want to be involved by taking a stance against such racist ideologies or actions which are occurring in front of them. They say, it doesn't concern me, I'm not involved in that. So they just sit back and wait. And we saw this in France, so we saw it under the Nazi regime, and in Germany, there were people who just sat back and waited for it all to happen. And in each example of institutionalized racism, you'll always find people who say no, people who have the courage to say no, who refuse racist ideologies and racist regimes. And people there can be extremely courageous and heroic. There are citizens who risked their lives to save people who were victims of racism. And then there are more diverse attitudes, people who've taken up arms, people who have marched with peaceful demonstrations in major movements. For example, the civil rights movement in the marches in the United States. So you can see that civil society can have very different attitudes, and it's not necessarily a question of elites. All citizens, you, me, everybody, we're all concerned by this. So we need to transpose this way of analyzing the situation and see our societies today in the light of such an analysis and say, okay, what's happening? Are there economic elites that want to have cheap labor and are going to say that certain people have little value? Are there elites who profit from the idea of rejecting certain people? And what is the role played by the media? I didn't mention that. You can see there are propaganda media that spread racist arguments. In our situation today, in France, we don't have it where racism is punishable by law, but you can still get stereotypes circulating. So these are all the contexts that need to be taken into account to see how racism is built in the context of a society. And I'd just like to conclude, if I have another couple of minutes, I would like to propose a definition and then come back to the micro scale. In other words, the level of the individual and see what happens in this interaction. We developed this for an exhibition on We and Others. This is an exhibition that was shown in France, and it's now touring France and will be touring around the world as well. It's going to tour North America. And we saw that there were three elements that need to be taken into account when we define racism. You have to see mechanisms that start at an individual level. And the first level is categorization. In other words, when faced with an individual who has a certain phenotype, we tend to put them in a certain category and give an identity to the person without even asking the person about anything. We can say, okay, that person is an Arab, that person is a Muslim, that person is a Jew. And so we have these spontaneous reaction to form categories. And we do that because the categories are there in the societies where we live. For decades now in our society, the category of Arab people has become accepted. But these are categories that have history too. These are categories which are built according to our history. I don't have the time to go into the full explanation of that, but you need to see the difference in scales there. You've got categorization, but the categories are affected by society. And the problem arises when the categories are then ranked according to a hierarchy. In other words, certain categories have less value, certain cultures have less value, and if you think that others have less value, then you have a problem. And then the final stage is after the hierarchical ranking, it becomes an essential aspect. The stereotypes and the features associated with the category are then set. And we say, okay, that's the way they are. They'll always be like that. It's part of their basic essence, and it's difficult to change them. So that's how we end up with racism. At the individual scale, we can say that it's a problem for the individual who has an identity assigned to them. We imagine the person to be like that, but they might not want to be seen that way. The identity features we ascribe to the person may not be those that the person identifies with. For example, a person who looks like an Arab, we may not want to be associated with what happened with his parents and grandparents. And even if he or she does accept that heritage, it should not be imposed. And we should certainly not be imposing negative stereotypes on that category. So this takes us to a situation where the person is in distress, because any person who is stigmatized suffers from that stigmatization. And to get away from stigmatization, there are different attitudes that can be taken. The person who's been categorized or stigmatized, in other words, a negative categorization. Otherwise, either they can accept the stigma associated with them, which means they may lose their self-esteem if they're not granted any value as a person, and that can be disastrous in the effect on the person. So they can accept that stigma, and it's a very difficult situation to be in, or the person might try to get away from the category. And you can see that there are people, for example, who try to make their skin whiter, or they try to change a category if there is no physical manifestation, such as the skin color, to give them a permanent category that's identified easily. And then the third reaction is to turn the stigma around the other way. This is known in psychology. The person says, okay, I accept that stigma that's associated with me. I am what I am. I'll accept that category, but I'm not going to accept it as a negative stigma. In other words, the person becomes proud of their background. They become proud of their culture, of the culture which is associated with them. And to illustrate that, you could say there's the movement in France, a literary and artistic movement of Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor with negritude, the Black identity. And they attached great value to their African origins. And we can see that there's a similar movement in the United States a bit later. So there's a way of getting away from the stigma that's associated with their difference. Of course, a person can be seen as a victim of racism, suffering from that, being rejected and being stuck in a category. And what is the person going to do? They might stay within their category and go back to their original groups and end up in a situation of distress where they reject any other categories. And so then the mechanism is reversed. And so the victim of racism ends up expressing differences and sees borders and rejects the other categories in society. I could still say a lot more, but perhaps I should stop there and should leave the floor for the other speakers, and we could discuss that later with the questions if you have them. Thank you very much for that. And now we'll go on to the question and answer session, and we'll start with the first one. What about positive stereotypes? Do you see them the same level as negative stereotypes? Well, I don't necessarily see them at the same level, but you have to be aware of them, and you have to be aware that a positive stereotype is not necessarily positive for the person concerned. For example, Jews have stereotypes that you could say are positive that date back to the 19th century, or the stereotypes that were spread in the 19th century and which still persist to these days, as we can see in surveys. In other words, Jews are associated with money, they're wealthy, they have power, they're always people in power, they dominate the media. Now, these are old stereotypes which still prevail today, and you can see that in studies. And what does that end up with? Well, of course, money ends up with crimes because you've got anti-Semitism, which has occurred in a violent way, which consisted of murdering people who they thought to be rich Jews. Thank you very much. The second question is, what argument do you use to combat such prejudice? What arguments can we use? Well, my proposal would be to try and understand and then try and identify the different points of responsibility, because we're in an ambiguous situation today. We have policies which, with a few rare exceptions, are anti-racist. They maintain they're anti-racist, but we can still find attitudes where politicians come out with statements and they reject certain communities, or they feel reluctant to accept some. And this is a problem. So we have to really point out these responsibilities. And the other initiative that we have to undertake is to combat stereotypes. You can see just how important stereotypes are. So they have to be deconstructed. But what does that mean to deconstruct a stereotype? That means you have to tackle a level which is not always easy to tackle. If you have a negative stereotype on, say, African people today, that is to a large extent because the relationship based on domination still exists. We still have countries from the north with economic domination and countries in the south. There's political domination, there's political interference, and for as long as that domination goes on, you're still going to have a vision which means that less value is attached to those people. They're not seen as being equal. So the idea of equality of nations, which was accepted in 1948, it has still not been fully accepted. It's not there, and we have to take action. Otherwise, we won't be able to get rid of the stereotypes by magic. We have to deconstruct them and see exactly how they work. Now we're going to the last question. How can you stop this establishment of categories, hierarchies, and seeing the essential vision of a person in racism? Well, I think I've already answered that to a certain extent. In trying to strike a proper balance so that we have genuine equality between countries. This has to be done at an international level. That can be done. And we have to give explanations and combat stereotypes. When people say Jews are rich, you say, no, look at sociology studies. And what does it mean to be Jewish today? Let's break down the categories and see that these categories are constructions, and that each of the categories, you get people who are very different. You can believe in God, you can have a background, you can have a belief in God which is very modest and tolerant, or you can be more radical fundamentalist. So there's great social diversity within the categories, and people tend to overlook that. So all of that has to be explained. And we have to realize that the categories that we're caught in, despite our wishes not to be involved, that these categories can be dangerous. But when you understand the mechanisms, I think we're in a better position to combat such ideas. Thank you very much for your answers.
So we're now going to
welcome Professor Rose Boswell. She's the Executive Dean of Arts at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. She's an anthropologist and a writer, professor of ocean cultures and heritage. Her latest book is entitled Things Left Unsaid, and she's also a PhD holder from the Free University of Amsterdam. And among many others, her research reveals a deep interest and diversity management, cultural heritage, and the role of gender in development. She has done a lot of field work in Mauritius, the Seychelles, Zanzibar, Madagascar, and South Africa. Madam, you have the floor for 15 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and also to all the colleagues who are present here. I think it's this afternoon on this side of the earth, but probably morning in Brazil and other places. So thank you for being here. I'm just going to try and see if I can share my screen. If you can see that. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, let's just get straight to the slideshow. Okay, great. So thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to speak, I'm going to try and fill in a few gaps that were, or points that perhaps were not necessarily raised by the previous speaker, and to talk a little bit about, to give a little bit more substance maybe to the discussions around the legacies of racism, and especially the experiences here in South Africa. So I want to share, first of all, that I was actually, I was born in Mauritius, Île Maurice, and this is a place where there has been a very long legacy of slavery and racism until very recently. And now I am living in South Africa, where we've had, a slave regime, and also colonial regime, and also apartheid. So the issue of racism is actually is quite complex. It's very difficult to eradicate. There isn't a simple rational response to its removal from society. So I have three questions that are in my mind. One is, what histories lie behind the current story of racism? And we've heard a few of those from the professor that spoke in the first instance. What are the current realities of racism, and what possible futures lie ahead if issues of racism are not necessarily resolved? So just some histories. slavery has, as many of you probably already know, slavery has existed for many centuries, as has stereotyping, which has been dealt with in detail. In the early 1500s, slavery became formalized when the Portuguese, leadership was engaging the people of the Kingdom of the Congo, demanding more slaves for its plantation on Sao Tome. And this basically led to the forced exodus, was the beginning of the forced exodus of millions of Africans from the continent to Europe, the Americas, and the Indian Ocean region. And I think it has already been said, and I'm glad that this detail was actually offered, that racism is and was an important philosophy or set of ideas that promoted both discrimination and enslavement. But I'm particularly interested as an anthropologist in the origins of scientific racism, because I think that it was very important for the early sort of discursive or ideological definition and circumscription of racism. From as early as the 1700s, there was this idea of the great chain of being, that all human beings were basically had their particular space or place in this idea or philosophy of the universe, and that we were not supposed to deviate from it. And the great chain of being basically included all creatures. It was a very sort of creationist approach to viewing the world. But the great change came when the discoveries that were made by Charles Darwin, and particularly his promotion of the theory of natural selection, which of course paved the way for our present understandings of evolution. But along the way, Darwin's ideas of natural selection were distorted in order to promote an idea of the survival of the fittest. And this idea, or this notion of the survival of the fittest, was promoted and used as the basis for some of the earlier sort of racist thinking. Some of you would have heard of the concept of eugenics. In fact, it was Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who was the big proponent of eugenics. And this is basically the science of racial improvement. And eugenics was a sort of scientific philosophy that was quite prominent in the time of the Nazis. This idea that you could produce this perfect Aryan race, and that all other groups that did not have those particular physical features or phenotypical features were then considered to be inferior and had to be, literally bred out of society. There were other scientific experiments that were conducted in order to promote this idea again of inferiority and superiority, craniometry, or the measure of the brain volume, for example, these were completely flawed experiments that with foregone conclusions. The idea that if you had a physically bigger brain, just as a greater ape has a bigger brain perhaps than lower apes, then you would in all likelihood have the makings of superior intelligence. But in fact, as we now know, intelligence is a combination of multiple complex factors of socialization, of education, of nutrition, as well as genetic inheritance. But it's not solely genetic inheritance, and it does not have to do with brain volume at all. There were other theories that emerged from this, and if you want to read a little bit more about it, I would recommend a very readable book. It's by the zoologist and also activist Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a book called The Mismeasure of Man, and in it he details the very long history of scientific racism and the fact that it continues to this very day. But the idea of prognathism, for example, was that even the angle of a person's face, so if you turned your face in the profile, if you had a more angled face, a more jutting jawline, then you were deemed to have a prognathic face, and of course you were also then deemed to be part of a group or racial group that has a lesser you were part of a lesser racial group. Recapitulation was the theory that these supposed lower race groups could not progress beyond certain age categories. So, for instance, the idea that Africans and African descendants would only be able to go up to the sort of early age of the teenagers. They wouldn't progress beyond that, and there were like particular stereotypes about what kind of emotional capacities, psychological capacities, intellectual capacities were possible for individuals within this particular category. So just basing on phenotype, in other words, on physical features, facial features, there was this idea that you could deduce what the capacities of an individual or a group were. And of course, there was, even at this early stage, and now I'm talking about the time of under the period of slavery to the early 1900s, both in the United States and various parts of the colonies in the Caribbean and also in the Indian Ocean region, there was also the racial profiling of behaviors. Some people think that racial profiling is something that started in the 1900s, in the United States, when people were being, lynched, for example, when African Americans were being lynched, in the South. But actually, racial profiling of behavior began quite a while before that, in the early period of slavery. And this mysterious mania or illness that you see on the screen called drapetomania was invented by a doctor in the 1800s, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Cartwright. And he was of the view that one of the reasons why the slaves living in the southern part of America and working hard in the fields, why they were slow and they lacked energy and were prone to perhaps breaking instruments that they were given in order to use to work the field, that they suffered from this particular illness which he invented called drapetomania, which among other things involved the insane desire to run away, which of course was perfectly logical when you consider that the millions of people that actually died under the institution of slavery. And I think the reason why I'm bringing this up, sorry, something's going on here, is that these ideas are not just systems or part of systems. They're not just ideologies that exist in some kind of social vacuum. They have major social, economic, and political, and even psychological, if not health consequences for the people that have to bear them. So whether it was in the United States or the Indian Ocean region under the period of slavery or colonial rule, or in contemporary South Africa in the last 300 years or so, we have massive poverty, discrimination, poor health outcomes, much lower life expectancy, violence in those communities that are structurally or racially oppressed, very poor education levels, poor housing, as well as inequality. And the terrible thing about racial discrimination that I think I would like people to think about today is that it also has knock-on effects for other kinds of discrimination. In other words, it can seed or provide impetus for other forms of discrimination, whether these are gendered discriminations, sexual orientation, ethnic discrimination, ultimately genocide. If I can speak very briefly then about the link between race and gender. I mean, even to this day, and certainly in the case of Southern Africa, you'll find that the African woman faces a form of triple oppression. She is oppressed in terms of her racial identity or her presumed racial identity. She is also oppressed as a woman because this is still a patriarchal society, and then she's also oppressed in terms of class. So all of these are the forms of categorization, some of which have been mentioned by Prof. Carol Reynaud-Paligot, is that that these forms of discrimination basically intersect to create a level of oppression that is very difficult to understand if somebody is not actually in that particular situation. Sexual orientation is another one. For example, I'm moving a little bit further ahead now in terms of the South African example, but in South Africa, you know, the rights of the lesbian, gay, you know, a bisexual community or transsexual community, these individuals are also even further discriminated against if they are members of the, you know, the African race, or as we speak here in South Africa, the colored race. And so these constructions are not just you know, ideological, intellectual constructions that are sort of floating about in society. They have actual consequences. It has also led to global inequality and forms of environmental degradation. So where we have individuals that are racially discriminated against, we often find that you know, the communities in which they live are far more environmentally degraded, and they're exposed to greater levels of environmental toxins than in places that are more diverse. So if you just have a quick look at this graph, I just want to show you, because I mean, somebody mentioned, I saw in the comments, that we mustn't forget that white supremacy has been an issue for the last 400 years. In South Africa, this has certainly been the case. And we know that from, you know, that the issue of racism goes way back to the arrival of, you know, the Dutch colonies in the country in the 1650s, and how that promoted, that arrival was accompanied by the enslavement of Madagascar slaves, as well as people from Java and the African peoples. But a point that is often not mentioned when we're talking about race and racism is the fact that it also fundamentally affects people who are indigenous. And by indigenous peoples here, I'm talking about, in the South African context, what in the United States, maybe we would say the first peoples. And in Brazil, we would also talk about the indigenous peoples, the Carib peoples. And here in South Africa, they are known as the Khoi people. And they were severely discriminated against. They were hunted, exterminated, basically, for their lands. And what has happened, you can see here from this graph, 1910 basically indicates the union of South Africa, the beginning of South Africa as a republic. And then you can see all the way up to 2010, which is 10 years ago. And the line at the bottom here, for the students that are with us, this represents the economic situation of our African people in South Africa. So this is the economic situation. If you look at the very bottom here, it tells you what percentage of the Black population exists in South Africa. And you can see that percentage is increasing. From 1910, it was 67%, all the way up to 2010, where it's now 79%. But look at what their income is saying. The average income per racial group, this is where the Black people are. The green line represents people of mixed heritage, and you can see it's not much higher. The Asian population is earning more, and the minority population in South Africa, the white population, look at what their average earning is and what the wage gap is between Black and white. And yet we have a population of 50 million people in South Africa, and the white population basically forms about 4 million. 4 million of that population consists of white people. I think it's also important to mention that that these systemic forms of racism are existing everywhere, and it's having you know, an impact on contemporary society. I mean, I took this couple of paragraphs from an article about George Floyd's death in the United States, which produced a sort of groundswell of support for the social movement known as Black Lives Matter. Floyd basically died in police custody on May the 25th. And this let loose a groundswell of public rage about the way that Black Americans are policed, but also deeper conversations about what is happening in terms of the coronavirus or COVID-19 hospitalizations, and why it is that people of African descent are in the United States in particular are the ones that are suffering and are dying. And if you look at the situation here in South Africa, again, South Africa is one of the hard-hit countries insofar as COVID-19 is concerned. And the majority of the people that are suffering from the epidemic and the people that are dying are those that can only access public health services. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, it's not just about changing attitude. It's not just about reformulating how we perceive or stereotype others in order to make them feel better, in their skins, but it's also about addressing the systemic forms of racism. And we see it also, I think, I would like to argue possibly even for Brazil, if we look at the COVID-19 impact there and where it is hitting the hardest and why it is that those individuals are worst affected is because of the perpetuation of systemic racism that is ingrained, as the article says, in nearly everywhere that people move through society, in the policies, in the practices at institutions like banks, schools, companies, government agencies, and law enforcement. And just to give you just a few words about what that means, in that last paragraph indicated here, is that an individual who is a person of color, especially in the South African context, for them to get access to a school that can provide them with the education that is required for them to move through the ranks in order to maybe become an academic or an engineer or a bank teller is extraordinarily difficult, because to get a bursary, you need to sort of qualify, to enter an institution of higher learning. And of course, the schools that were provided for the African people under the racist apartheid regime were of the lowest quality, meaning that these individuals in no way were going to be able to move through the ranks. And why was this done? Because the big question is, why was it done? Well, if we look back to the period of 1910, and I'm just going to say a few words about this, it was basically very much for the sort of for capitalist for capitalist reasons, because there was a discovery of gold and diamonds in the country. And the country itself had a wealth of land and natural resources. And these were very attractive to the people that were coming to South Africa from the 1650s onwards. And today, this wealth is still in the hands of the minority. And unfortunately, the masses of local people don't have access to those assets. So they don't own any collateral. They only, if the ones that have made it through the system have only their skills. Very few people, even though we have something now called Black economic empowerment, it's not, there is this perception that it is Black economic empowerment is something that is influencing, a range of people or a wide group of people across South African society. But it's not the case. In the same way that people believe that affirmative action, for instance, has really made a huge difference to American society or to South African society, it is not the case. So, I think as young people, maybe we need to imagine that there are two possible futures that we can imagine. One is on the left-hand side of the screen is this idea of a connected, disconnected, in our cultural box kind of future, where we see these discriminations in the world, we see these systemic forms of inequality that exist, and we choose to look the other way and to embed ourselves in virtual worlds where these things cannot touch our reality. So that's one aspect. The other one is to look at the realities, to face the realities, and to co-create a world where these systemic, inequalities are slowly but surely and definitely eradicated and changed. And I think that is a future that we should aim for, because the dystopic future is not sustainable. In fact, the more inequality grows in our society and our world, the more violent and difficult it will become to live in this world. So it's not just a case of an individual needing to make a difference because it helps somebody else to feel better in their skin or to feel psychologically secure. It is about maintaining a world that we can all live in. And so it is imperative, actually, to not just to challenge the stereotypes where we encounter them in our schools, in our homes, in our communities, but to also, when we go out into the working world, to pay attention to systemic forms of racism and to address these systemic forms of racism in order for the world to be a more equal place. So thank you. That's all I have to say for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Rose Baswell. Now we're going to proceed to the Q&A questions. So first of all, our participants are wondering if you can repeat the title and the author of the book you recommended.
Yes, it's a book by Stephen, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, Stephen J. Gould, G-O-U-L-D, and it's called The Mismeasure of Man, The Mismeasure of Man.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's now proceed to the questions. First one, do you believe critical race theory provides an appropriate lens to counter the failure of neoliberalism to address systemic racism?
Yes, I do. I think it's important to have an integrated set of theories to help us understand racism. Because as I mentioned, you know, the experience of racism is an intersectional one, in that you have the crossover often of gender, of indigeneity or indigenousness playing a role, age and gender, sexual orientation. So critical race theory can certainly help in this regard.
Okay, thank you so much. So the second question is, how can you explain that Black population revenues have stagnated over the years?
Okay, so there was a quote that I wanted to include in my presentation, and then of course my slides became really long, so I thought, no, let's just leave it out. But there are development theorists, one of them is Samir Amin, who speaks about the fact that racism, one often imagines that racism is a nationally grounded phenomenon. In other words, it's something that's happening in South Africa because, you know, those South Africans, you know, under the apartheid regime, they haven't moved on. Or it's something that's unique to the United States with its history of slavery and, you know, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, et cetera. But actually racism is a global phenomenon, and it was founded, you know, on a system that perpetuated global economic inequality. And those global economic inequalities continue to this day, in terms of, if you look at trade patterns, trade deficits, and so on. And also, you know, the extent to which, you know, the colonial process put in place, you know, regimes that, you know, that have not, for a very long time, did not function. Or they created political vacuums. I mean, the terrible story, for example, of genocide in Rwanda, you know, is a case in point, where there was a political vacuum that was created, you know, after the return of the Belgians, you know, back to Europe, and the problems that were created in that country, that, you know, stereotypes that had been fomented under colonial rule. Not to say that they were not there. You know, there are substantive studies to show that those stereotypes, you know, existed, you know, during the period of Belgian colonial rule, but they were fomented and augmented in the periods leading up to the successive, you know, genocides that took place. It wasn't just the 94 genocide, there were others that took place before then.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's now proceed to the last question. Do you think that victimized speeches might fuel racism?
Sorry, what was that question?
Do you think that victimized speeches might fuel racism?
Victimized features?
Speeches.
Oh, yes. I think that is a possibility, in the sense that, you know, it can draw attention to the suffering that people are experiencing at any given point in time. But I also want to add, I think it's important to add that, and I don't think, I'm not sure if the previous speaker mentioned it, and then that is that you also have gradations of racism that because of the nature of the ideology, it's perpetuated even within categories or people of color. So whether in Brazil or the United States or in South Africa, you have these ideas that are perpetuated within groups that are themselves stigmatized, which then creates further division. So it's pernicious in that sense. It's not just something that is between, as they would say in South Africa, it's not just between black and white.
Okay, thank you so much for this interactive session. Maintenant, nous allons avoir une pause musicale. We're going to have a musical pause au son du piano par Madame.
We're going to listen to Miss Paloma Fayet, who is going to play Armstrong by Claude Nougaro.
Je ne suis pas noire. Quand on veut chanter l'espoir, quel manque de peau.
Bravo, merci beaucoup.
Well, congratulations, thank you very much. We're now going to hear from Professor Lazare Kizerbo. Mr. Kizerbo, good afternoon. You are a philosopher by trade and an interdisciplinary researcher in human sciences. In 1986, you joined the Paris Sorbonne University in the philosophy section. Then you did some research in Poitiers, and you then achieved your PhD on the 7th of April 1994, the day when the genocide started in Rwanda. You have the floor for the next 15 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be a part of this thought-provoking masterclass on racism, or rather against racism. Yesterday and today are the International Days of Philosophy, or for philosophy, so it's a great way to contribute from my standpoint to this event. Now, I don't know if this is going to be possible, but can we have up on the screen the very first slide? Here we go. Okay. So this is a quote from Lamartine. He's a French poet from the 19th century. And he was an intellectual, a philosopher, who was very committed to fighting racism. It was a cause very close to his heart. And Toussaint, who is the hero of independence in Haiti is featured in this beautiful text, and this quote comes from there: "I am the color of those who are persecuted." So the intellectual approach is there to show that there is a universality in humanity. So it's about making man God in a way, and that's something that runs across all cultures. You can see this in ancient Egypt, for example, with the human spirit that goes to a second realm, so to speak. And then the Greek philosophy with the whole idea of the dignity of man. In any case, I think that this is one of the things that philosophies around the world have inherited as a legacy, that idea of human dignity as being the hallmark of cultures around the world. So I'm not going to dwell on this any longer. Maybe we could move on to the next slide. There we go. Now, as you mentioned earlier, I carried out a lot of research on contemporary philosophy, and in that context, I looked a lot at phenomenology. Now, there are a number of considerations, of comments from Ms. Boswell and Mr. Carroll, who were very interesting, and that pertained to the fact that human beings see the world through, let's say, glasses. They always have an angle on the world, be it the material world or the human world, the social world. And it's particularly true for the social and cultural world. We do see things through a certain lens, a certain angle. Now, we have a lot of jargon in philosophy, and it can get a bit confusing, but the key word here is intentionality. In other words, any act that is conscious expresses a certain perspective on life. When I was listening to this piece of piano, I was listening to this music in a certain way. It was speaking to me in a certain way. And if I were to go back to the classroom in a couple of hours' time to give a class, I will see things through a different lens. So that's what I'm trying to get across. And this is why Jean-Paul Sartre said that human beings are always in situ. Now, over and beyond, before we talk about racism as being a negative way of seeing people, a negative angle, you need to, first of all, be aware of the fact that we are always taking position. And culture is precisely about this. It's about building a sort of shared position or shared lens to look at the world. There are always perceptions. That will always be the case. We can't achieve a world where everything is neutral. There would always be some positioning. We would always break our reality down into a series of categories to try and make sense of it. That is inevitable. And these categories have are relatively relevant to what we believe to be true. Now, the studies on these matters are very numerous. I'm thinking, for example, of Franz Fanon, who went to Algeria. And when he saw the violence of French colonialism in Algeria, he decided to defend the people of Algeria. And he too talked about intentionality and existentialism. And he talks as well about the psychiatric, psychological suffering that people in Algeria were undergoing at the time. So that's it for the reflection about the philosophical principles that allow us to understand, in a way, the root causes of racism. And I'd like to talk about Alfred Schutz, who is someone who is often overlooked, but who is nonetheless a very important character when we talk about the philosophy of conscience, because the acts of discrimination, all these violence acts, are all based around perceptions and projections, and that's important. So just a quick word on Alfred Schultz. It should come up on the next slide. His picture should come up. There he is. Alfred Schutz himself was a victim, like many other European and Jewish intellectuals. He was a victim of racism. In the 1930s, along with many other people, including Einstein, he had to flee Europe and went to the United States of America. Schultz had fully understood this phenomenological approach, the fact that it's our conscience that approaches the world. It's through that that we see the world, we color the world. And he then later discovered, when he was fleeing racial discrimination in Europe, he discovered that he was also racially discriminated against in the United States of America. And this is why he decided to look into what we call the phenomenon of interactions. I don't want to delve too far into that, but this idea of interaction is really about the fact that the social and cultural world are based on symbols and on representations that are activated through our relationships with other people. It might be with your neighbor, it might be with someone that you've never met before in the street. And society is precisely that, a sum of many, many interactions. And I think that this process, this approach, is particularly important to try and pick apart the different ways in which racism manifests itself. There are some historical examples of discrimination, Nazism, slavery, etc., etc. But there is also this collective repression, this collective racism that finds its expression in everyday life, in the little gaps of everyday life, so to speak. When you sit down, for example, in the metro in Paris, some young people who come to my class, they feel that they are victim of racism or of discrimination when they're in the metro. If it's, for example, someone from African descent, if they sit down on a bus or on the metro in Paris, they see their neighbor stand up, and they stay standing up like this because they don't want to be sat down next to a black person. So it's about this racism of every day, and Schutz allows us to see that. And racism is also about insults, about these interpersonal interactions that are brutal. It's not always a political machine that sets out to destroy a community. Sometimes it's small individual interactions. Now, with everything that we've achieved in terms of human rights across the 20th century, with the with the Declaration of Human Rights and all the legal tools that flow from that, we might be protected to some extent from a political machine, but we're not protected from these small individual interactions that are based on false perceptions, on prejudice. And that's one facet of racism today that we need to take into account, this sort of everyday racism. Next slide, please. There we go. So this is what Schutz said. He said, prejudices are rationalizations
of the underlying central myth upon which the self-interpretation of the group is founded. C'est-à-dire que ce que nous avons appelé tout à l'heure.
So what we called earlier intentionality, in other words, the projection of an individual, of their conscience on the environment, is expressed here. In other words, when there are prejudices, when there are stereotypes, we turn them into something objective, and these representations, often we are forced, so to speak, to take ownership of them from a very young age. Some people have grown up in a world where they have negative representations of other people, and they just reproduce and pass these representations down. It could be through advertising, through film, through anything. This mental aspect, or this visualization of racism, is very important. Today, I think that racism, or the fight against racism, must first and foremost start in people's mind. We need to fight against these negative representations, mainly the ones that we see in the media. For instance, I come from a Western African country in the Sahel region, and every time I talk about Burkina Faso in the media, the country is labeled one of the poorest countries in the world. So the media also have an important role to play, because when they always put this label on African countries, some African countries, of course they're going to have, that's going to have an influence on how people in Europe or in the West see people from that country. So I think that that kind of attitude, that kind of speech should be addressed, because in a country with some 20 million people and its own history, it's quite unfair to say that that country is just one of the poorest in the country. And what does it mean, poor, anyway? What is the criteria that this judgment is based upon? It's not even objective, because I can tell you that in terms of happiness and smiles, the happiness level in the country is extremely high. Now, I'm saying this just to try and make you smile, but it's just about trying to get you to understand that there are different ways of seeing things, and that what the media tells us and tells us how to perceive things is not always correct. Next slide, please. So our cognitive landscape is the one that allows us to understand the world and to interact with the world. In other words, it's a certain number of representations, of symbolic constructions in our minds, and over and beyond the media, there are other habits, other historical elements that shape our vision of the world. Take, for instance, what we have, take, for instance, the United States, where there is this chasm between people who are black and people who are white. So much so, in fact, that we always have these two categories of people in mind when we think about the United States. And yet there are a lot of people who had a black mother and a white father, or the other way around, and they don't fall into the white and black category. Barack Obama was talking about colored people on his promotion tour for his new book. So he wasn't talking about black and white, he was saying colored. So I think that this colored vision of the world will be corrected and hopefully abolished. But it only reflects the way in which American society has integrated slavery in its more modern history. It's the repercussions of slavery that are finding their translation in contemporary American society. So that's a representation that I think we should correct or deconstruct, rather. Maybe that's the best way to put it, because it is extremely pervasive in the United States, and it's really a huge part of the problem. There is the economic side of things. There is discrimination, of course, but this sort of colored categorization of the world is something that we should do away with. And in that area, I think that international cooperation is a great thing, because the European model, for instance, or the French model that is based around universality is something that we should strive for. Of course, it has some limits, and I'll probably talk about this in a minute if I have enough time. But in this area, I think that we should be able to share our historical experience. And I think that France's way of seeing citizenship as people all on an equal footing, is something that is good. Not like in English-speaking countries where you have communities. Now, it's not that simple, of course, but I don't have a lot of time. So this whole idea of universality over and beyond the color of skin. In France, we had black African members of parliament. Some of them could have been president of the Republic. This universalism, it's something that is very French. Of course, that's on principle, and on principle not only, but mainly. And I think that there we need to have a critical way of looking at this as well. Because yes, it is true, we know of Voltaire and Candide, and the Nègre de Suriname, this very important piece of work by Voltaire, where he denounces slavery. But the sort of French philosophy, la philosophie des Lumières, needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, because it has also factored in a lot of racial prejudices of that era. And even Voltaire had made some comments that were quite racist. He was very much a man of his era in that regard. So we need to be aware of this as well.
Voilà. Donc, je vous ai mis ici comme référence.
So here you have a study by Laurent Estève. That's about 20 years old now, that's a study, but he's looked into this gray area of the philosophie des Lumières, and he showed that Montesquieu, that Rousseau and others, in their way of seeing slavery, did not go all the way and in condemning racism in principle because they believe in equality. They didn't go all the way when it comes to slavery. If you look at Rousseau, for example, he makes some comments that are somewhat suspicious when he talks about natural rights. There seems to be an exception clauses for Black people. Likewise for Kant. So when we are teaching philosophy, human sciences, humanities, it's important to take a step back and to show that even the more kindred spirits of a certain era in Europe were also prejudiced in their own way. Now, next slide, please. Now, given these limits, what are the other traditions or the other schools of thought that we can use so that philosophy can truly help the fight against discrimination? Well, there's one school of thought that started out in Latin America some 20, 30 years ago that we often call a decolonizing school of thought. Now, it's a sort of a bit of a buzzword and has been a buzzword for some time. But in that Latin American tradition with Aníbal Quijano, we have a good tool, so to speak, to deconstruct the categories of racism. I would just like to talk about what Quijano said on racism, something that is quoted very often. He says that race was imposed as a fundamental criteria for universal social classification of global population. So there's been a huge amount of work undertaken to put people in boxes, so to speak, to put them into categories. But Ms. Boswell talked about it earlier, so I won't say much more on that. But it's just a way for you to understand this concept of intentionality that was based around the power of states and the power of ideology. Another philosopher, an American philosopher called Hannah Arendt, who very much like Schutz left Germany. She was a student of Heidegger. She left Germany and sought refuge in the United States of America. And she wrote an essay on imperialism. And she tells us how the power of states, how bureaucracy, especially for South Africa, has codified and materialized in society these categories that flow from a racist way of thinking. So from that standpoint, it's important to take into, oh, sorry, I see that you want me to wrap up, so I'll be quick. So you need to take into account this work of deconstruction that that I've been describing. And that sort of ties in with Pan-Africanism. And I'd like to talk about Webb Du Bois quickly. He was a historian and also one of the main activists in fighting racism in the NACCP. And I'd like to talk about someone else who is very important in my eyes. Can we go, Arlene, maybe to the previous slide? There we go. And his name is Antenor Firmin. Antenor Firmin is a thinker from Haiti. Symbolically, for me, it's very important. Haiti is where the abolition of slavery started out. And if we are to deconstruct racism, we need to make sure that Firmin's work is better understood, because he was one of the very first to work on Boino. Boino was an ideologist of racism, and unfortunately, of course, he inspired Nazism. But when his pamphlet on the inequality of races came out, that's when, well, that's one of the texts that Nazism was based on. But Firmin came up with another text that was very interesting and completely debunked, demonstrated scientifically, in a way, that racism was wrong, didn't make any sense. So I think that Antenor Firmin is someone that should be studied a little bit more. So to conclude, philosophy and universality and taking everybody and putting everybody on an equal footing is something that is crucial. But we need to reassess European philosophy, rethink it. And I think that this decolonial and Pan-Africanism can be interesting tools for the future. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for this speech. A lot of questions have come in for you. The first question, how can you fight against hate? There are so many people right now who are not victims of slavery, but who feel this daily hate. How can we remove hate from the heart of people in so many societies around the world? Well, I fully understand this question. I take it to mean that when you want to fight racism, you need to have a representation that is wrong. For example, if you say that black people are being oppressed and that white people are the oppressor, I think you need to look at it in different ways. You need, first of all, to understand that these representations still exist, but also work on the theoretical side of things to show that they're representations, that they might be true today, or they might exist rather today, but they will disappear in the future. I currently live in Guyane, where we have a great diversity of people, and I see children grow up without having any idea of these different categories that we've just been mentioning. They're completely blind to that kind of category. And that might be down to music that open them up to new horizons, and they don't see the categories that we see. But from a point of view of public policy, it's important to take these categories into account. So I think that we need to look to the future, and I think that these representations are going to disappear, whilst, of course, in the meantime, being clairvoyant when it comes to the present and being aware that these categories exist. Okay, second question. How can we make sure that these stereotypes don't become a stereotype for the people who are subjected to them? So, in other words, how can we make sure that stereotypes don't shape the personalities of people who have been discriminated against? Well, that ties in with the first question. Ms. Carroll earlier talked about negritude. Aimé Césaire said that negritude is an anti-racist form of racism. Now, it's quite shocking to say to hear that from a person such as Aimé Césaire, but it's a kind of reaction-based racism. Racism should always be, of course, condemned. But it's really about someone being oppressed, being defensive. I'm not saying that the victim can become racist or that it's right that they do so, but I'm saying that sometimes the victim, when they decide to rebel, can be provocative. that can happen, but maybe it should be perceived like the reaction of somebody who's got their back against the wall, that is constantly being pushed in the back, constantly being insulted, and they're just shouting back. That's what they're doing. They're screaming, nothing more than that. So long as it's just a scream, a shout, as long as it's only that, so to speak, then it's okay. You need to be able to distinguish between what an artist can express in terms of revolution and then a system of racism like Nazism or anti-Semitism, for example. I think you need to be able to take this step back and tell the difference between the two, to tell the difference between a dogmatic speech saying that one part of human community is inferior and somebody who's just being very defensive because they're being very repressed and oppressed. Could you give us a few examples where, in countries where racism has disappeared and where there's a true harmony between people from different backgrounds and origins? Well, maybe Ms. Boswell could tell us a bit more about this. But racism, it's a bit like democracy. If you want to fight for it or fight against it, depending if it's racism or democracy, it's something that you need to do every day. I truly believe in this sort of everyday effort. In all societies, there is racism, but we need to be able in our everyday lives to fight racism or to fight for democracy. In Guyane, for example, I can see that we are in a kind of a sanctuary of a post-racial society. Of course, there are communities, but what I see is some people who are white and who speak or dance or do activities that are not that activities or dances that would be deemed as for white people. At least that's certainly what people from France would say, but not in Guyane, where it's a post-racial society. But it's not just about intellectual efforts, it's also about representations, about image.
So it's an ongoing battle to eradicate these negative images and stigmatization. And we do this through education, through proper teaching to eliminate these stereotypes. Thank you very much, Mr. Kizaro, for that. We should have had the next speaker, Mr. Senani Saba, but for personal reasons, he hasn't been able to join us today, and we're sorry about that. But I'm going to change languages.
I would like to recall to all of our students that we will have an interactive dialogue sessions just after where you're going to be able to take the floor. So do get prepared to reveal to us your ideas of engagement and commitment around discrimination and racism. For this, please write down on the chat box your age, school, and country. I repeat, age, school, and country, so we can include you in the dialogue session speakers list. So now we'll change back to French to welcome Monsieur Arnaud Desmanches. Soyez le bienvenu, Arnaud Desmanches.
Now, I'd like to welcome Mr. Arnaud Desmanches. He's a comedian and a writer, a French comedian writer. Now, he launched an award with others known as the Gerards of cinema instead of the Oscars, and they've done others with politics. He's done lots of sketches with well-known figures in France, and he's been involved with a number of well-known programs as well. Now, Mr. Desmanches, you have the floor for 15 minutes. Microphone, please, sir. We can't hear you. Sorry, I turned off the microphone. Good day. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Good day. Fine. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Arnaud Demanche. I'm a humorist, a comedian, and I'm invited here today because I have a one-man show performance on racism. It's called White and Heterosexual, and it talks about the experience of a white heterosexual man in France who has not had to deal with racism, obviously, but who is part of a society which conveys racist prejudices and oppresses minorities. So what's the experience of a man such as myself in this society today? I wanted to work on that subject because I come from the city of Versailles, known for the palace, and it's also a very conservative city, a very Catholic city. And when I was a little boy, I'd never met any blacks, Arabs, Chinese, Indians, or other minorities. I could give you an example. There was someone who stopped in the middle of the street and pointed to the person and said, "Look, look, there's a black person." You see, that's how exotic it was. And when I left Versailles, I wanted to work on racism because I realized that this was not a normal state of affairs. And I decided to be an activist with anti-racism groups, and I realized there was a problem. And we can see what we've done in this conference, where we've done different diagnoses of racism to see where it's come from, how it's managed to impregnate society and spread through society, and how, in theory, we should stop it. But the problem is that theory and practice don't always come together. And if you want to do something practical to combat racism, it's very complicated because you quickly realize, well, you quickly realize that when you say to someone, you behave like a racist, well, they don't appreciate it. It's never very nice to be told you're a racist, particularly if you're just focusing on social images. And there are people who are racists and who focus on the main person. But if you're just part of systemic racism, it's not a voluntary act. It's not that you're trying to, it's not as if you're trying to do something wrong. You're just reproducing patterns and behavior patterns of others. And if you go around saying to people, you're a bastard, that just doesn't work. That's not the way you're going to get people to understand that there's a problem, that they have the wrong attitude, and that there's a general problem in society. And Lazare pointed this out very correctly. It's through culture that we can get the movement against racism developing. So I decided to do my show to talk about that, to talk about the experience of a white person who had been told by society that he was a problem. And I don't think that I'm a bad person, but I still have to stop and think about things. And that's why I'm here in this philosophical workshop, because obviously a stand-up routine and humor can be seen as philosophical because you have to deal with concepts and get ideas across to people in worlds which are not necessarily the worlds that we live in. And this is part of sort of mainstream education. So I saw it as important to work on that subject. As I said earlier, you can have direct consequences if you want to be an anti-racist activist, because your statements might not go down very well. For example, if you go and see someone and tell them that they're a racist, whereas they don't think they are, then you're going to get the person's backup. And this is not a minor problem. It's not a problem of a white person just whinging, saying people are nasty with us. No, no, that's not the problem. If you start abusing people who don't think they're doing anything wrong, they'll obviously take it badly, they'll react violently and they'll say it's not true, and they'll start arguing. And this is what you can see, for example, in the United States at the moment, because the Democrats and Republicans have been arguing for so long that they can't understand one another, they can't have discussions. And humor is very important here because humor opens up an area for dialogue. If you point out how certain situations are absurd and how certain behavior patterns are absurd, you can get a more relaxed situation and people can start discussing things. So humor, stand-up routine, or culture in general can be seen as having that role there. It's not just a matter of dealing with racism, but of bringing people to understand something which they wouldn't have been able to understand otherwise or wouldn't have wanted to understand otherwise. And you can't do it through theory. If you make people laugh by confronting them with their behavior and showing them that it's absurd, then they can come to terms with that. People are not born racist. They're not intrinsically bad. They don't really want to go off and hate blacks, Arabs, Jews, and others as soon as they're born. No. But over the years, they've learned a number of prejudices, and once they're stuck in them, it's difficult to get away from them because they can't see where the problem is. So the strategy of comedians for years was to make fun of racists, and then we realized that it didn't work. It just made people angry. And anti-racist movements too have the problem because the underlying argument is aggressive, it's binary, it's based on stereotypes. The stereotype of anti-racism is whites hate black people, whereas we know that racism has always existed from time immemorial in all societies, that millions of people have suffered oppression throughout history because of racism, and that you can find it in every part of the world. And of course, whites can be racist amongst themselves. We were talking about Nazism earlier in the conference, but you can find other forms of whites hating whites and so on. In France, for example, if you ask a Frenchman what he thinks of a Romanian, he'll say, okay, he's got half his teeth missing and he plays the accordion in the metro. You see, you get those stereotypes that exist between white people too. So anti-racist arguments didn't have the subtlety needed, at least for some of the people who were trying to get the anti-racist message across. So the exercise then became counterproductive. So that's why I wanted to do a show on the subject so that I could get people to understand what systemic racism was without accusing them. And this goes through metaphors and examples in everyday situations. Can you hear me? There's a problem with the sound, says the speaker. No? Fine. So the examples which are used where people who are victims of racism might experience. I've done a lot with anti-racism organizations, with blacks and Arabs, who, for example, are victims of racism here, and I worked with them to see what they experienced in their everyday life. And I ended up with an image, and I did a video sketch which has now had 2 million views. And it was a real revelation. It was a turning point for plenty of white people who just couldn't understand what was involved in systemic racism. And talking with these people, I realized that racism was a bit like wearing snow boots all the time, as if you're wearing 30-kilo boots all the time, or 10-kilo boots. Okay. It doesn't mean it's not going to stop you getting up the stairs or walking all day, but when you go off and apply for a job, the person's going to see that there's something wrong, there's something different about you, and different ways of thinking that are triggered then. If you go out and look for an apartment and you say to the owner, my name is Mamadou Camara, the owner is going to say, oh, your name is problem with the rent. And if you say, my wife is Fatima, he's going to think, okay, your wife is cheating on welfare benefits. He's never going to say it in so many words, but he's going to have that idea in the back of his mind, and he'll refuse to rent the apartment or give you the job or whatever. But if you say to a white person, apartment owners are racist, they say, no, 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 it's not true. I own an apartment and I'm not a racist. And then you say, but be honest. If a man turns up and says his name is Mamadou Camara, and one turns up and he's called Pierre Dupont, which one would you take? And they say, okay, yeah, that's true. You've managed to get them to understand something, but you haven't accused them. Lazare talked about the importance of culture. And I really think it's the best response that we can have to racism. You've got music, songs, acting, comedy, culture, literature, humor. And humor is wonderful because at the end of the show, people have had a good time and they're happy. And when they're happy, you can teach them things and bring them to accept new ideas. And they leave the show with something which is not enormous, but it's going to counteract a small prejudice that they have. And so gradually, with little steps, you manage to deconstruct racism and then destroy racism. The fact that we are leading as comedians, as humorists, is to maintain the right to make fun of everything and with everyone. Because one of the problems we've had with anti-racist activists is that they've infantilized racist victims, and they're overprotecting them, sometimes in an absurd way. For example, they've ended up with comedy festivals in English-speaking countries where they asked the comedians to sign contracts that their jokes would not shock anyone. You can't do that. First, it's absolutely idiotic, it's counterproductive, and it's just impossible for a comedian to do that. Every joke's going to shock someone at one point or another. There's always someone who can say, I take offense at that, but it's not because someone takes offense that you're right. You have to settle the problem of racism between adults. You can't deal with victims as if they're always children that need to be protected. You can't overprotect victims with a layer of politically correct behavior, which is perfectly futile, because they are adults. And there is a point when you can have real dialogue between adults. And it's the same when you want to talk to someone who's a racist. You can't talk to him as if you're a child and say, that's not the right thing to do, you're wrong, you're horrible. If you talk to him as if he's an adult and explain things, make him laugh a bit, make him think a bit and say, have you seen this? Have you read that? Without open warfare, then you're going to have positive, constructive, intelligent dialogue. One of the main problems that we have in the world at the moment is hatred on social media, hatred via Twitter. In Twitter, you have, what is that, 280 characters? How can you have proper, subtle thought and intellectual content in 280 letters? It's just too small. And so everybody has now started reasoning in a very binary way. And instead of having a forum for dialogue, we have a forum for hatred, which is just extraordinary. Hatred on Twitter is multiplied by a factor of 10. It's increased to tenfold over recent years. And we've seen a revival in racist behavior, which we thought had disappeared. When I was 25, 30, and I started my first anti-racist actions with associations, I dealt with violent stereotypes. People said, you know, black people are thieves and the Jews are the people in power running the world. And I thought that that sort of stereotype had disappeared these days in France because we didn't see it. But now, over the last 10 years, these stereotypes and prejudices have come back and in incredible proportions. And Twitter has no proper dialogue, no subtlety, no nuance, and you don't have input from people who think the way we do. And I think that through humor and culture, we can do something to combat racism. Basically, we don't tell people that they're idiots. You have to see the subtlety between someone who does something racist one day and someone who is racist. There may be someone who at a point in time has racist behavior, but they're not necessarily fundamentally racist. That's what I wanted to say. And if you have any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them. I see that there are some questions there. I hope I didn't go on for too long, but once I start talking, it's hard to stop me. That's fine. We do indeed have questions. So we'll start with the first one. Yeah. Can you make fun of everything, or are there limits? You suggested that. Yes, I can see what you're trying to get me to say. I've got two parts to that answer. I think you can laugh about everything with everyone, but what's important is the way you do it. Comedians have their presentations, which are now relayed because you can get sketches that get up to 10 million showings, and you have to be very aware of the way people see the sketch. If you want to make fun of things, you mustn't think it's the same thing as mocking. To mock something is bad, but to laugh is dialogue. You can speak out against something that's absurd. You can speak out against behavior which may be racist, and that's not an attack, whereas mocking something is an aggressive attack. So you have to see what's there. And you also have to wonder about what you're going to say at the end. What is the purpose of what you're doing? Can we draw things? Can you do cartoons on everything? I would say that cartoons are an extension of comic shows and talking, because cartoons are a visual presentation of verbal statements. And I think behind this question, you're thinking of Islam. And in Islam, there's a layer which is the question of depicting the Prophet, because that's seen as sacrilege in Islam. That can be taken into account. And I haven't made up my own mind on that subject yet. Okay. Now, in your sketch, if I'm right, it's based on real facts. What were the reactions of minorities in your sketch? What are the main conclusions that you've drawn from it? Now, if you're talking about the racism sketch, which I put on the web, I got good feedback from the minorities. I got messages and was very touched by them. I got lots of messages from people who said, this is the first time we've heard a white person who can understand what racism is. It's the first time we've seen a white person using simple, clear words to describe what we feel. Sometimes there are jokes, and I base them on cliches and prejudices, and you've got a touch of humor or sometimes a bit of provocation, because comedians are provocateurs too. But the idea is to get people to understand what systemic racism is and how it's felt in their daily life. And when George Floyd died and said, "I can't breathe," we had to realize that that statement, "I can't breathe," went around the world and echoed with people who suffered racism. And it was because racism was something which stopped them breathing. It wasn't just the policeman's knee on George Floyd's neck. It's because racism does stop people leaving and breathing in a relaxed way. They feel as if they're being stifled, choked all the time. And when you realize that, it's important. And it's not necessarily intuitive for white people. You don't feel it. You don't see it on an everyday basis. We're not necessarily concerned by it, we think.
Le faire comprendre à d'autres blancs sans les amener vers soi, sans les faire rire.
But you have to do something to get other white people to understand it, and getting them to laugh is a good way of doing it. And that's the feedback I got. I got lots of these messages saying this is the first time we've seen a white person saying or describing exactly what we feel. And I'm not saying that just to compliment myself. The next question is on the role of art. How can art play a role to combat racism? Well, I'd say it's of critical importance. You have to let artists do their work. You have to combat censorship. You have to read as much as possible. And even in popular everyday culture, there's some wonderful things. For example, Jean-Jacques Goldman's song, born in 1970 in Theresienstadt, and he thought what would have happened if he'd been born in Germany in 1917, or what others would have done. And Michael Jones thought, what would have happened if he'd been born in poor district of Belfast? Would he have become part of the IRA in the war? If he'd been born in South Africa and so on? You can't judge people individually. You have to see culture as different. You have to go and see people who are different from you, who don't come from your own background. I come from an incredibly conservative background, and I agree totally with what Lazar said earlier and what Rose said earlier. It's not because I'm not from the same background that I'm not you, that I can't understand you. And this applies to militant anti-racist activists who can't understand that a white person wants to speak up to defend their cause. And it's also what racists think when they think that other people are not as worthwhile as they are. You have to see people in different areas, and this is what culture can do. You can find a hero in a novel who is not necessarily the author. And you can have someone describing an experience that they've never known as a little girl or as an adult. And the author's natural empathy may express something which could be rejected by, say, a Black person or an Arab person, but which could be supported by others. But you have the right to interpret a person who is not yourself, a character who is not yourself. You have the right to understand a person who is not yourself. And because I'm not the same as you doesn't mean that I can't understand you. It's all very well to have your heart bleeding for others, but don't forget that you need to have blood irrigating your brain as well. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the answers. It was very important to have your contribution, and I'm trying to follow the different screens there. I'd like to thank you, and we're very pleased to have you here.
Because we have just got to an interactive dialogue session with our students. So this is a very special part of this masterclass. Indeed, as I was saying, we have gained a lot of knowledge and insights in how to deconstruct racism, how to understand certain behaviors, as Monsieur Demanche was saying, and how to take action, even if it's in a smaller and a bigger way. This discussion is indeed full of valuable perspectives, and we have a lot of takeaways. But as explained earlier, this masterclass does not only aim to disseminate knowledge and share experience, it is also about setting commitments, as we told before the presentation of Mr. Demanche, and how can we make a positive changes in our schools and communities for those students who are watching us. We have now come to this part, and I would like to know if we have students that would like to take the floor to tell us and reveal to us what are your plans and how you can share this knowledge with your peers, with your schools and your communities. So I'm waiting for a very encouraged students that would like to take the floor. I will like to know from the UNESCO technical team if we have someone. So please do not be shy. I will maybe give them a few minutes to see if we have students coming up. Oh, apparently we do. So we have a student, Malinali. Maybe we can give her the floor, or him. I don't know. In any case, the floor is yours. We're waiting for you, and thank you so much for coming up for this Q&A sessions with our teachers. Yeah, so I'm just gonna send a very little message. Can't put her on. In the meantime, does someone wants to share maybe a conclusion, maybe a comment on what we have talked so far? Maybe we can have the word of some of our speakers. Oh, she's connected to the panel. Okay, so let's give her the floor. Shall we give her the floor? Let's see. Apparently not. Malinali Mejia Arellano, can you hear us?
Yes, I do.
Great. Do you mind putting your camera, or is it too much asking?
Yes.
Yes, you can. The floor is yours. I mean, we are waiting for you to exchange with us. What are your plans and what do you want to put forward from this masterclass?
Well, I can't turn on the camera, but I want to share my opinion.
Yeah, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Masterclass has taught me a lot of things that I didn't know before. Many of the history of how Africa has suffered.
And do you're planning to do an activity in your school, or what are the commitments that you are planning to engage with your fellow classmates, or have you come up with idea, I don't know, maybe to create a social media account to promote the values that we have been sharing today? What are your main takeaways from this masterclass in terms of action?
In terms of action, I am working on myself. I am decided to working on myself because the change, as most of us may say, starts with us, with our example, taking action on thinking that everyone is the same and everyone should be treated with respect, no matter their ethnicity, race, know that.
Okay, so you're saying that you're working with yourself. Do you have any examples, and what have been your actions so far to fight discrimination and racism?
Yes. To include people that are different from me. For example, in my group, when I work in group, if I see discrimination from one partner to the other, I tell them that we are all the same and we should work together in order to accomplish our goals and get the job done.
Okay, that's great. And definitely here from UNESCO, we encourage you to continue doing your work. I have a request from a teacher from Canada. She's saying that if we, let me see, because as I was telling you, I have so many things to read here. So I will beg your pardon. So we have someone from Canada telling if we can contact our MP. Veuillez contacter votre député et dites-lui que vous voulez son soutien pour la journée d'émancipation.
Please contact your MP. In Canada, it was on the 1st of August 1834 that slavery was abolished, and there is a white paper before the Canadian Parliament.
Maybe you would like to join us here in the floor. So I don't know if you, let me see. Do we have some some students that would like to take the floor as well. We had Malinali. Thank you so much for sharing with us your expectations about your future actions or your current actions with this. So I don't know if to the speakers, they actually understood what I said, because I slightly changed to French. So basically we have a teacher from Canada that it's working for the Emancipation Day. Apparently this marks the end of slavery in Canada, which was effective on the August 1st of 1834. So she has been working for this initiative, and she will be going to assist to the second reading early December. Can we talk a little bit more about how the end of slavery in countries like Canada, for example, have marked out the future actions, or maybe a progress in all the thematics concerning the fight against racism? Does any speaker would like to take the floor on this? Basically on how these kinds of actions have determined the future of, or maybe the present actually, in a daily life fight of discrimination and racism. So the floor is yours. If you would like to take it, just let us know.
Moi, je veux bien continuer à parler, hein, mais...
Well, I can go on if you like. Yes, well, go ahead. We're all ears. Well, I wanted to add a point which I feel is important. Racism is, of course, something which is interesting to deal with, but it isn't necessarily at the root of all the problems we're experiencing today. And that's a mistake that is often made when you work on the subject. You see racism, you tend to see racism as the root of all problems. And that's what happened in the US, where the anti-racist discourse drowned another discourse which is necessary, that is something pointing to the predator capitalism. Look at Amazon. Amazon is currently running lots of campaigns saying we hire everybody, we're very good employers, but they still don't pay them properly. $1,000 a month to live decently, you need to earn a lot more than that. So these are people who say we are anti-racist, we're against racism, we have no prejudice, but it's hiding all the rest of the problem. And that's what happened in the US presidential elections, because Trump's followers felt they were stigmatized, especially the poor whites in former industrial states. They had been told, you white people are privileged. But how can you say that to somebody who lives in a trailer earning $1,000 a month in a country where you need $2,000 to live decently? They don't understand. So if they hear somebody say, look, follow me, I'm going to make life better for you, and we're going to get rid of these minorities that are taking away your jobs and your pride, that inflates racism, especially if you consider racism is the only problem. If you want to work against racism, you must also look at everything that surrounds it. That's my opinion. I'm expressing my own opinion. I think it's important to see that racism is a factor of the world's misery, but it's not the only single problem. In the US, there's a true fight against racism, but crazy capitalism isn't being questioned at all. My feeling is that you've got a capitalism there, a capitalist society which has gone mad. So when you say, playing jazz, is that cultural appropriation? When you so that's a question, but maybe you should first wonder whether you shouldn't pay black factory workers better. So that has to be borne in mind. That's what I wanted to add. Otherwise, what you get is wannabe dictators getting elected. And so thank you for that. I'd say that is very positive. I think we've got somebody who'd like to speak from the Philippines. So I'll give the floor to David Floyd Roxas. If you can hear us, you can go ahead. I don't know if we've got him online.
Yes, Arlene, thank you for recognizing me. Although I wasn't actually nothing to share for the group. I was just I entered what you asked in the chat box a while ago. But at any rate, so maybe what I could share for with regards to my takeaway for this master class is that racism is actually a problem. As mentioned before, it is a global problem for everyone. But with regards here in the Philippines, racism is very predominant when it comes to class statuses. Aside from the ethnic discrimination that we have here, maybe what I could contribute or what we could contribute is that coming from the Philippines, we could have seminars or webinars like this one to promote the values of hospitality, the values of brotherhood, the values of respect for each other as we promote a universality for every kind of race that we have, especially in other countries or in one place where there is a melting pot of races.
Okay, thank you so much, David. So we were actually talking about the actions that you will undertake after this masterclass, such as creating another type of webinar, such as this one. Do you have any other examples that you have might be involved in the past or you will be in the near future about how to fight discrimination and racism in the Philippines? How is it these how Philippines is actually fighting, or what are what is the action of local communities in terms of the fight against racism and discrimination? Can you illustrate us a little bit on how is working in your local community?
Yes, so for example, in UP Diliman, in my university where I study Masters in Philosophy, we celebrate equality among gender, among races. Where, for example, we have a month for celebration for indigenous people. We have a month of celebration for gender equality. We call it the Pride Month. And throughout this month-long celebrations, we conduct activities from which talks, such as talks, musical activities, concerts, from which we could bring together indigenous group. We could with other minorities that we have in our countries in one activity. Aside from that, we are also active to protest and conduct mass demonstrations before, or at least even in this time, while observing physical distancing. So it's really a problem for everybody to express ourselves, especially in this kind of pandemic. However, we still strive to conduct this even in the virtual space. So that's what we do here, at least here in the in my university. in trying to eradicate or somehow educate those who tend who do not want to be educated in or who tend to be ignorant with this kind of racial discrimination or racial disparities in our society. Beyond that, there's also a problem of ignorance, mostly for what's happening in our country, because there seem to be a predominant of discrimination or hatred among believers of those who support the government and those who are being critical about it. So you all know what's happening here in the Philippines, from which the government had been very deaf in the calls of our citizens, most especially, for example, red tagging. For example, we just had a red tagging issue in the university where we students of the University of the Philippines are considered as communists. Not that I have a problem with communism, but that we respect their ideologies on that aspect. So in this case, this could be considered as a racism by ideologies, so
Okay.
by the government itself. So we're trying to fight that.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing with us those feedbacks about your future engagements and how is the situation currently in the Philippines. Apparently, we have another speaker, which is Maya. Maya, do you have the floor? So please be welcome to this interactive forum. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
So I just have like a suggestion how like racism has come around. And
please tell us where you come from and which school are you involved
in? I come from England, United Kingdom, and my school is Notre Dame.
Okay, thank you so much. So go and share with us what you would like to reveal to us.
So from history, racism, how they like segregated the communities of like, so how they separated the white community and the colored community, and when they're separated, they grow and behave with their own ways, and they grow with their own like ways of living, and then when they come back together, then they have the different ways of living, and they would think their ways are better than how like someone else lives, if you know what I mean. And this can like build up hate to one person that they have a different way and like our way is better. And then I have another one for discrimination, how like in the workplace they employ people and they might like put their name, or if they have disabilities or any of the protected characteristics. And then if they are identified by their protected characteristics, then they might get a biased view on how that person can work instead of looking at their life skills and qualifications. So one example is if they're married or if they're not, then if they're married, they might like
Don't worry, you actually are inspiring us, Maya, today. We would love to have seen your face. Just as can you actually tell us how old are you?
I'm 12.
You're 12. Wow, what a great. I mean, you're full of wisdom, Maya. Have you been involved in any activity? How do you come to us to be part of this youth engagement network here at UNESCO?
I got invited by UNESCO to come here. I don't know how, but I know that I entered a competition, a writing competition for UNESCO on the problems in the world. And it might have been through that, but I don't know.
Do you mind showing us your face before we pass the floor to someone else?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being with us here, Maya. It has been a pleasure. So now we will pass on the floor to Carla Carmina. Carla Carmina, can you hear us? Is Carla around? Maybe yes, I'm seeing she's connected. Maybe she speaks French. Carla, est-ce que tu nous entends? Carla Carmina Landagan.
Carla Carmina, can you hear us? Could she be admitted? Carla, hello.
Can you hear us? Oh, apparently that connection is not very good. So can we have maybe a couple rounds of 1 minute last conclusion from our speakers so we can pass on to conclude this masterclass, if someone would like to take the floor for the last time? Maybe Arnaud, Lazare, Rose. We have also Professor Carole.
Oui,
oui, allez-y, professeur, je vous en prie.
Vous m'entendez?
On vous entend très bien.
Bon.
Okay. Well, I must say that it was a very interesting exchange. There was a question earlier. I don't know if the person is still online. In relation to everyday life and interactions. So that's social sciences. I referred to phenomenology, the Latin American school, which stressed the dimensions of knowledge related to power, theoretical constructs that underlie European racism. I hope that that will be helpful. And I suppose that if this person is in Latin America, they won't have any trouble finding the necessary sources. Anyway, I encourage all these young people to keep mobilized. You don't necessarily want to wield weapons against racism because you wind up sometimes doing exactly what you're seeking to abolish. So it has to be a subtle mix of deconstruction, persuasion, public education through exhibitions, films, and the like. So it's all these things together that will overcome the practice of racism and the representation of racism. I'd say that the year to come, a lot will be said about everything that was done before to fight racism. I think that major forums are a good thing. But I'd say that it's local experiments in schools, in communities that will help the upcoming generation to live in this world, a world of a variety of colors, but without these stereotypes. So it was a great pleasure to be with you today. Thank you. Okay, so we'll try and keep it very brief. Do we have someone else Does anyone else want to take the floor? One of the panelists? Okay, no? Right, well then we shall conclude. Well, thank you very much for having joined us for this master class. And I shall maybe switch to English.
Thank you for this wonderful exchange, everybody. We are very inspired by the proposals and that you're putting forward, whether it's in the Philippines or in the UK. Let me remind students that we have prepared a short questionnaire so that we can obtain your feedback on the masterclass and also have a record of commitments if you are willing to take. If you have any other ideas, whether it will be next week or next month, please send us your message to the email address masterclass@unesco.org. Send us anything that you have, whether it's big or small, and UNESCO will be more than happy to reply to your message. That ends our masterclass today, and on behalf of UNESCO, I would like to thank all of the speakers for the enriching testimonials. Let me also thank our new batch of new young champions who will be part of this UNESCO network, who are advocating for inclusion and diversity around the world. We hope that we will be able to talk about your experience here in the masterclass and inspire your peers and fellow colleagues to join your future editions. So as promised, we are now giving you another musical treat from our artist, Miss Paloma Fayette. Madame, c'est à vous. Thank you so much for this. Merci à tous et puis bravo, oui, à une prochaine fois au sein d'une prochaine masterclass avec toute l'équipe.
Thank you so much and see you in a future masterclass. Once again, thank you all for participating. Bye bye.
Merci.